Just like GPS is always available to us, those satellites are constantly revolving around the globe that we sit on right now. So too, God is always available to us. But often we fall prey to believing that we can do life on our own, and when our attempt to live as if we don't need God falls flat on its face, it's in those moments where we realize we need to get back to something that's constant. And we are found wanting to get back to where we need to be. But to do so requires that we have to starve something. It requires that we have to starve our ego. And only by starving our self-focus are we able to reorient ourselves to God's presence that's always been there with us. But I know sometimes it can feel like God is absent. But God reveals in his word and ultimately through the life of his son Jesus that this is not the reality. Rather, it's a distortion of reality. The reality is that God is always near us. But because we are focused on our own self, we aren't oriented to recognize God's presence with us. In order to see God's presence with us, we have to reorient ourselves. Fasting is one such practice that reorients us to see God's presence with us. What we encounter throughout the Bible is that the act of fasting can help orient us to God's presence. One thing that fasting isn't about is a transaction with God to get him to do something for you. This view of fasting starts with the premise that God is not already for us and wanting to be with us, or rather that God needs something to gain something in order to care about us or spend time with us in the first place. But this is not the image of God's character that Jesus reveals to us. Jesus reveals that God seeks to be with us even when we are far away from him. John in his gospel notes Jesus saying this in John 12 verses 32 through 33. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. And Paul notes something similar in Romans 5 verse 8 where he says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. What we can gather here is that if God is willing to seek after people even when they're trying to kill his son Jesus, then fasting has little to do with getting God's attention. The thinking here goes, if I fast or if I give up something, then I get more access to God's presence. The premise of this thinking isn't that God is absent. The premise assumes that God is already present, but it assumes that some of God's presence is somehow withheld. A form of God's presence that is only available through an exchange of spiritual motions. Like if I fast, then I get a greater access to God. But again, this is not the image of God's character that Jesus reveals to us. Jesus reveals that God does not withhold his presence from us. Rather, it is we who hinder ourselves from being in God's presence. God's not the issue. We are the issue when it comes to encountering and having access and recognizing his presence in our life. If you've ever used Lego blocks of any kind, you know that it can take some maneuvering of a piece to get it to connect to the other pieces. The piece needs oriented to the other pieces in order to work the best with the other pieces. Fasting isn't about doing something to get God's attention, and fasting isn't about gaining greater access to God's presence. What we gather throughout the Bible is that fasting helps orient us to God's presence. Fasting helps orient us to see how God is already with us even when we haven't been paying attention to him. Fasting helps orient us to see the access to God's presence that has always been available to us even when we've hid from it or ignored it. Throughout the examples of fasting in the Bible, fasting was a tangible way of posturing oneself to see God for who he is and who he promises to be. What we can gather about fasting throughout the Bible is that it can help orient us to God's presence. Fasting orients us to more clearly see God's presence that is already with us. Fasting can help orient you to God's presence.